Well, hello, and welcome back. And if you're listening, thanks for listening. And hey, you might get to hear a lot of dogs barking. I don't know how good this mic's gonna do, but you may not hear that happen. But if you do, it always reminds me of a Jane's Addiction music video that I love, Been Caught Stealing. So you can look that up. And we're on page 42. Yeah, and this is On the Path, an anthology on the Noble Eightfold Path drawn from the Pāli Canon. And this is by Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu, who's an American Buddhist monk, widely respected for his translations of the Buddhist teachings, making them accessible for people like me. And you can get access to this book and actually find out more information about Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu in the Notes from On the Path thread that is running off of the book club channel and the Meditation Mind Discord server. So that's how you can find that. And so usually at the end of each episode, I will drop, I'll oftentimes when I'm commenting, I will drop references, just things to, that come to mind. And so what I'll do after an episode, when I post the episode, I'll also post links to things that I referenced to, just in the hopes that maybe it would be useful for whoever is following along. And so that's kind of what's going on here. When you get to that Notes from On the Path thread, then just click on pinned in the upper right and you'll see little information about the author, a couple of videos actually, so you can actually see him, hear him, and then you'll also notice at the bottom you'll see a link to this particular book. And he's written many that are in the Creative Commons that you can access for free. So pretty cool stuff. All right, I'm going to get on with it. So yeah, we're on the bottom of page 142, respectively, and I am going to begin. The first part of this question, as Sutta 123 shows, builds on the basic meaning of self, that it's something under your control. If something changes against your will and leads to stress, it's obviously not totally under your control, and so doesn't deserve to be regarded as self. So this is really profound. If you're looking for something to contemplate while you're sitting in meditation, maybe I would recommend contemplating on that sentence, reflecting on it, maybe journaling about it, what you think it means to you. I'll tell you what I think it means to me. If something changes against my will and it leads to stress in me, to anxiety, to fear, to worry, to rage, right? So something arises. Stuff happens in our lives every single day. Sometimes it's small stuff. The light bulb went out overhead in my room here. So when I went to go sit in the Discord server, I like to turn my camera on to try to connect with people, and they couldn't see me because when I meditate, it's still dark. Oh, God. Right, so from that, I'll put that on 0 from my view. Not to, I don't want to, this is not a judgment, okay? This is all also understanding that we're all fabricated, right? So if you've got a lot of trauma, right? A lot of trauma, then lots of things can trigger response, right? This is actually really why I would encourage you to work with someone. To my view, that idea of going back to the 12-step model, there is a common quote that is referenced in most 12-step meetings, regardless of the addiction that they are working with, attending to. I like that. Attending to, caring for in community. Oh, I think that's my favorite. Yeah, that one's my favorite right there. That's the sweet spot. To my understanding, it's got an anonymous author, but it just goes, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. There it is, right there, right? What Buddha was getting at here, right? Can we recognize that there's a whole lot of stuff in our life that we can't change? To that suffering of life creates suffering, which he also calls stress, right? So anyway, I know I need to keep on moving, but I think we're off to a rip-roaring start here, with a very powerful sentiment in Buddhism here. The line of questioning is effective only when the mind is not hungering for the pleasures of the aggregates. This line of questioning is effective only when the mind is not hungering for the pleasures of the aggregates. If it still has that hunger, then no matter how much you focus on the drawbacks of the food it gets from the aggregates, it will still refuse to abandon them. And that comes from Sutta 295. It would be like telling yourself that because food is temporary and the search for food is stressful, you're going to stop eating. Do you see how practical Buddha was? How rational Buddha was, right? He's really, really playing on just logos here. Just think about it. And if nothing's coming to your mind right now, well then in practices like Buddhism, and there are other practices as well in the great wisdom traditions, including, and I don't even want to get, because I don't like to speak of those things of which I know nothing or very little, and that's most things. So I just try to, recognize they exist, bow in reverence to thousands of years of evolution of culture and whatever. But again, think about what's being said here. And I've talked about this before, that I am far from awake. That I've also talked, again, if you're just kind of doing a one-offie on an episode here, then I repeatedly talk about how, in Buddhism, it would be the karmic seeds that are ripening for me in this lifetime are anger, or, what I get to work with. I like to call it, for secular people, the quality that I get to work with in my personality. Some of it comes from not really having space growing up to have my own space, have autonomy. And so over the years, right, the Gestalt, all the stories, right? Humans write stories. We need to. We need to write stories to make sense of our lives and to make sense of our lives in relationship to others, because we're always co-regulating with others. We're never perceiving reality in a silo. Well, I mean, I guess you could do that. I mean, I certainly have lived that way deliberately. And, Buddha recommended it and did that himself. Leaving a family behind, I recognize, and you're right. You're right. For those who are, in the Discord server, say, hey, what's up with that? That wasn't a very good dad. But at any rate, so I skipped a paragraph here. So I'm gonna go back and then I'll finally move on to what I was talking about. However, this reflection is on its own not enough to put an end to passion. Okay, so the reflection that's being said here, right, going back to what I just said, is the reflection that, hey, there's stuff that's going to happen that's out of your control. It's causing you stress, but why are you getting stressed out if it's out of your control, right? Like, are you really in control, right? It's like this kind of, yeah, so how, if yourself's really in charge of things here, then why are you freaking out with it? Okay, so there we go, we got that. So here it's saying that, kind of that understanding, coming to that maybe realization for yourself isn't enough. So let me read that sentence again. However, this reflection is on its own not enough to put an end to passion. And as I just mentioned, this is what I've had to work with my whole life. I have always been a unbelievably passionate person, okay? So great, I got that going for me. says Buddha, but it's also what is the thorn in my side, says Buddha. However, this reflection is on its own not enough to put an end to the passion, right? It's not enough to put an end to that passion in me. Fire, fire, fire. Ah, I'm all fire. So it's not enough, right? It's not enough in Buddhism to kind of acknowledge intellectually, pragmatically speaking, that, yeah, there's a lot in my life that I don't have any control over, and that's really freaking me out and making me unhappy, and I don't seem to have any control over that. So, do I really have a self that's in control of my life? And Buddha's really, this is the heart of what Buddha's asking us here. This is the real heart of dropping from duality to non-duality. Are you sure you're a self? You don't even have any control over this dynamic, right? And that's why it's not enough to put an end to passion. The really effective reflection is in the second part of this question, which is the value judgment. If something changes against your will and leads to stress, is it worth the effort of clinging to it? Now, this is where I would say, again, this is a huge, huge, very nuanced aspect of Buddhism that the West never talks about, so that means I have to assume that they just don't understand. And I'm sure that there are people that talk. I'm not like, oh, I'm the only one. I'm your Western guru, Sarah. No. Oh yeah, my name is Sarah, by the way, but most of you figured that out already. Not at all. That is not at all what I'm suggesting here. But I am suggesting that, and I'm sure I'm not alone in suggesting that, this right here is where I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is so profound that it actually has created a belief about Buddhism that is actually completely contrary to what Buddhism actually is. What it actually is. Right? If something changes against your will and leads to stress, is it worth the effort of clinging to it? Okay, so now this is gonna be a little trigger warning for you. But I talk about this a lot in the podcast. I had some pretty rough months in my own recovery process when I was in my very early 20s. I just got out of the Army, and I got a really stupid injury, and it was just a dumb injury, and got out during training, and I was not in a good place, and I wasn't treating people well. I wasn't self-aware. I was operating from a trauma conditioned response. And on a certain level, looking back in hindsight, now that I'm 30 plus years older than that, my heart just goes out to the people, that were on the receiving end of my poor social skills in a lot of ways, because I was asleep. I was not awake to my trauma. I just wasn't awake to how I wasn't awake. I was even awake to the idea that the trauma had affected me. What I wasn't awake to is that my behavior was affecting other people. And that there was an aspect of that was a part of all of this. And as I talk out loud, I have to acknowledge 100% that as a Westerner who knows a lot of people who have experienced a lot of harm because of their Christian upbringing or Catholic upbringing, and again, I always bow to the authentic wisdom tradition underlying all of that. But shame is a sticky Shempa word for me. But what I'm describing, I would say, as I talk out loud to myself before I need to move on, which I need to do soon, is that I'm describing the experience of shame. And it's a very slippery slope, because so I was in a particular type of 12-step program for a really, really long time. Okay. And in that particular program, I just learned a lot of tools that I would say, I try not to drop any of that stuff on here because of their traditions, and I just don't want to cross the line, but learned a lot of tricks, learned a lot of tools in there to kind of help me to, and so a lot of them were journaling tricks and tools, like actual books, that, my sponsors would have me complete, and give me a homework assignment and say, okay, so, answer these questions and try to be honest. I had this one person that I was working with, and she was really helpful for me because she was a woman who was also really scrappy like me. And so there was never any weird kind of tension between us. This is why I really love living in New York too. I live on the West Coast now, and there is a huge difference between, I find, New Yorkers and West Coasters, and I kind of fit in really well, like in New York, because New Yorkers are just kind of like, hey, what the fuck, man? And I'm not going to say I'm quite that, but, I'm definitely very direct. I shoot from the hip, and I'm always kind of genuinely surprised when people are offended because but you asked my opinion, so then why did you ask my opinion? So, there's just kind of a temperament there. At any rate, I need to get on with it. I'm just going on and on. So I'm just going to do that. This is why the full-blown use of the 3 perceptions is reserved for the final level of right view, after right concentration has been mastered enough to provide enough nourishment for the mind to step back from its usual hungers. Up until that point, in the development of mundane right view, the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self are reserved for such things as wealth, relatives, or health that might induce you to engage in unskillful behavior. Meanwhile, you actually try to develop a sense of self around your desire to develop skillful behavior. Because at this stage of the effort, that attachment is still worth the effort. And this is from Sutta 217. Okay, so this to me is kind of how I look at, my own place in my life, right? Like I have a consciousness, I have a body, I live in the world. So this idea that, so I'm in the mundane phase of right view, right? Like as I've mentioned before, I have had experiences that one, again, I've talked about this before, one that happened, on I think day 6 or 7 of a retreat that I did, and then one that didn't happen through meditation. It just kind of happened. And, in Buddhism, we don't chase those things, but, we also acknowledge in Buddhism, and again, I'm not a scholar, so I don't mean we like, oh, we're all we, okay? When I say we, I just mean people who decide to practice Buddhism. I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying, hey, the people who decide to practice Buddhism, we would suggest that what that might be that I've experienced is a higher level, a higher jhanic state, a higher jhana. Glimpses that saved my life. The first glimpse was, the first glimpse is for me. How about that? But I'll tell you that these glimpses, they don't drive my practice today. And the reason why they don't drive my practice today is because of the reasons that Buddha talked about. And really it was kind of like, he wasn't saying you mustn't do this. It's more like, hey, it was always about strategy for him, right? Remembering that, last episode, this again, in earlier sections of the book, Bhikkhu's talking about how Buddha kind of thinks about all of this as if he were a doctor. We can think of our mind as if we were doctors, right? Rather than becoming so, which we all are, unless you've trained your mind and kind of, been relieved of this kind of delusion, then you can get a little space and you can start to become a doctor and observe and go, what's this? What's that? Right? See last episode, last section of the book. But here he's saying, hey, why is it maybe conducive to still think of self? Even though I've said, hey, no self, no worlds. He's saying, but don't misunderstand me. There's this kind of esoteric notion of not self, no self, but then we're also embodied beings living in the world. And the Buddha made it pretty clear that we are beholden to fabrication and the five aggregates that are constantly changing, impermanence, right? And so that's actually what's really going on. But he's saying here, hey, wait though, understand me. I'm not unicorn dust and fairy farts, right? Yes, we have to live in the world. So we do need to have a sense of self, because that is going to be the fire, that sense of self. So anyway, I'm gonna go on, but this is why I do have to be mindful of clinging to Buddhism, but this is how I apply my sense of self. I'm a body in the world. I've made a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of things that I'm sorry that I did, people that I hurt, including myself. I know that I want to, I have a really clear sense of what I want. I want to be of service. I want to be a light. I want to be of aid. I also know about myself that my definition of kindness is not the definition of kindness that most Westerners perceive as kindness, that I have to find my people because I don't have a popular approach, but I have a lot of belief and and passion in my approach that I believe comes from traditional Buddhism. So there's a lot going on here, right? So all that stuff that I'm telling you, you betcha that's identification. Listen to what I'm saying. Am I identified? Yeah, I'm identified. But in Buddhism here, Buddha's saying, no, this is the kind you want to cultivate. Notice something though, that in Buddhism, you're not right. And I'm putting that in air quotes. You can't see me because there is no, this is tricky, right? Because there's right view, right this, right that, right this, right that, right this, right that, right? You're right. And you're going to see all kinds of what appear to be paradoxes in Buddhism. So I'm just going to tell you how I grapple with all it. Well, I don't grapple with it because to my mind, it makes sense. And so I'm just going to do my best to put into words why it makes sense to me personally. Because Buddha says from the outset that this is just his subjective experience. To me, Buddhism is kind of like a phenomenological qualitative study that Buddha did. N equals 1. N equals 1. 1 equals Buddha. Siddhartha. No, it's not. N equals 1, N equals Siddhartha Gautama. I'm sorry, it's one of those. Right? And then through the actual N equals 1 experiment, he became Buddha. Right? So when he's saying it's right, he's not saying, all of you people out there are wrong. No, he's saying, hey, this was my phenomenological study on myself, and this is what I learned about my own mind. This is what I need to hold for right view. This is what I need to do for this, and if I do these things, I have discovered that life is indescribable and don't feel like going down that road. Similarly, in the development of transcendent right view, the three perceptions are not applied to states of concentration themselves, for that would interfere with their development. Instead, the three perceptions, or variations on them, are applied to the distractions that would pull you out of concentration. And that comes from Sutta 235. At the same time, you continue to develop a responsible sense of self that feels capable of sticking with the path. Sutta 221. When you have mastered the path to the point where a sense of self is no longer necessary, when the mind has tired of the fabricated nature, even of the concentration it has mastered, and so wants something better, only then are you ready for the final stage. Fascinating. It's been a long time since I have studied Buddhism in this way. And I don't have a teacher right now, so I'm always want to make it really, really clear that I'm not a scholar. Okay, I'm not a scholar. I haven't taken any classes. I haven't studied under anyone. Well, I mean, I have a long time ago, but, I've been out of the game, and I never took like a certification course or anything like that. So this is always kind of coming through my understanding of what I have learned through various teachers, and through my own, long time meditation practice. I am going to admit that I am a little bit stuck here, and this is when I very much want to have a teacher, because I need an admirable friend to help me to understand this, someone who knows about this more than me. So let me tell you where I'm struggling here. I'm just going to really get into the weeds with you, because that's what I do, baby. Okay, anyway. So I have experienced the sense of self where it is no longer necessary. So this one's a little bit, this is where I'm really, and I'm not saying this to brag. I mean, I think if you just meditate on a regular basis, I have. Every time I get on the cushion, that's what I'm training in, And I can't explain. You'll just do it, And again, I realize, also that I have been told that maybe there are some people that will maybe never have access to any of this. And what I would say is, does it matter? Like, here's the thing. If any of this is making you feel anxiety and anxious, and you notice a lot of judging me, and that's okay, because that's what we do. That's what humans do, right? We judge. I do it. We all size each other up. We had to. Think about it. If we didn't size things up as a species, we would, we would have been lunch for something, someone, somebody, some delightful creature. So we do that, right? We judge. But if you're feeling that kick up, then I would say, then this isn't for you. Find the thing that makes you feel better. I've been really struggling. This book club for me is to I felt a strong desire when I left my job, and it was a wonderful organization and a wonderful job. My career, the career of education is, it was a true calling and a great vocation. And when I left that job, just finishing, right now I'm finishing my doctorate, and just like lots of just like, okay, what's, I could feel kind of like a pull, and wasn't really sure what to do with the pull. And so, and also, some other things that I had noticed, some bad habits had crept in, because I had not carved out time, or I had allowed my time to be up for debate and discussion. Are there a lot of selves and worlds that I could blame? Sure, but is that a strategic thing to focus the lens of my awareness on? It was for a while. I needed to go through that, and I think a lot of the world right now is kind of at that adolescent stage. It's like they're just raging and they're angry, and everybody's to blame, everybody's at fault, and no culpability, which is a very kind of emotionally kind of immature maturity, right? Like I have no role to play. Nope, I have absolutely no culpability. I have no part in this dance, even though there is no dance in the entire dance of life that you dance alone. Not one. Even if you're grinding on the dance floor by yourself, just the people that are 50 feet away from you are impacting your experience. And so, anyway, I always go way off the rails on these things. I'm just going to get back to reading, okay? The suttas show how this final stage happens in 3 phases. In the first phase, the target of your analysis is the state of concentration from which the mind has been viewing other events in the mind. As AN 9:36 and Sutta 312 explains, once the concentration has been mastered, in the same way that an archer might master archery. Ooh, I love that analogy. You analyze it in terms of the 5 aggregates, applying a number of perceptions that expand on the primary 3 of inconstancy, stress, and not self. Under the theme of inconstancy, you can also use the perception of disintegration. Under the theme of stress, you can use the perception of a cancer, an arrow, painful, an affliction. And under the theme of not self, you can use the perceptions of alien and an emptiness. And so the idea here, what they're using, you can use the. Why is Bhikkhu doing that? And I realize that right now we're reading Bhikkhu's, kind of introduction to the actual suttas. He's giving his, very, experienced, he's a monk, right? So he's helping us to understand, and then we're going to get to the suttas at the end. But you keep seeing this repeated, right? You can use this, you can use that. Again, there's no self, right? You can use, you're just kind of like a ball of stuff that's going on. Hey, there you go, get that bumper sticker, right? I'm just a ball of stuff that's going on. Well, there's more to it than that. So actually, I don't know if you could get it all onto a bumper sticker. But if you do look at it from that way, right, then it's easier for you to see it as these are just some tools that you can use to work with these things that you call self. Well, they're not self. You're clinging to phenomena. There's phenomena arising in your body, and now you're like attached to certain aspects of it. And now you built up a whole story around it, and now it's become your story. This is my story. My, mind, self, world, self, mine, I, mine, I. I realize this is not a popular view in the West. That's okay. You don't have to agree with me. But I do hope that you will, show respect for my religion as I show respect for your psychoanalysis. Yeah, which some of it was taken from Buddhism. Thank you, William James. These perceptions enable you to develop dispassion for the concentration and progress to the second phase, in which you incline the mind then to develop a passion for the discernment that sees the deathless. And in fact, in the early stages of awakening, this is precisely what happens, preventing the mind from advancing to total awakening. Still, these earlier levels of awakening are useful because they show that in abandoning the aggregates, the mind doesn't starve. Instead, it touches a happiness that requires no feeding at all. So, again, I think what's being got at here is why in Buddhism, there's not so much of an emphasis on attaining, are there deep meditation practices in Buddhism? Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of the heart and soul of Buddhism. But it differs. It differs from other models that use these kinds of practices in so much as that it's not particularly interested with higher levels of jhana. It's not particularly, it's impermanence, right? Recognizing impermanence, recognizing that getting hung up on that is how you stay in dukkha, right? It's this disenchantment. It's this, if you're still clinging to all of that, then you're going to be constantly disappointed because nothing stays. Nothing stays. Nothing stays. Stop clinging to it, right? Even to those higher jhana states. And Buddhism would argue that if you think that because you've attained a higher jhana state that somehow that makes you a guru, well, you might be a guru, but you're certainly not a Buddhist. Then, as Sutta 138 notes, it's necessary to drop any attachment to this very last act of discernment. Seeing all mental actions as fabrications unworthy of attachment, right view is able to see itself as a mental action, and so unworthy of attachment. Okay, so, and yeah, I would say that this absolutely does happen. And there's no, and so, okay, so I would still love to have a teacher. But I think I understand what's being said here. And yeah, I would say that, if you really do practice Buddhism and you just kind of, this is my experience of Buddhism is, in kind of taking it seriously, and taking the effort that's kind of required seriously, you do come to see this for yourself. You do kind of come to recognize, and this is really, I think, what insight meditation really comes down to. When people are talking about what, insight meditation, And, again, I didn't realize that Vipassana wasn't an actual sitting practice. It was a way of life. And I didn't realize that. So pardon my ignorance. But, insight. Yeah, I think that's, again, this is what's really being got at here. Insight meditation. People ask a lot about that on the Discord server. What is insight? What is insight? Well, it's this. It's just this. It's not, it's a big deal, and it's just not that big of a deal. It's just kind of, it's this. You just kind of start to note. It's like someone just turned a light switch on, and you go, oh man, what? Look at that. But you're not going to be able to have that experience, that relationship with it, if you can't sit through the fire of your mind. Again, I think I referenced this video in the last episode, and if not, I'll make sure to reference it in this episode. Dan Harris, who is an American, very famous broadcaster, had, I think he self-described it as a nervous breakdown on the air. And if you ever see it online, my heart just went out to him. It's just, wow. And he's amazing. He's incredible. He's also a really big fan of Buddhism. And I believe he says he's Buddhist as well. And he's the one behind the, one of the really big apps. I'm sorry, Dan Harris. But he also has a really great podcast. And I think it's 10% Happier, I believe. And I love to watch him on YouTube, and I subscribe. And he's a neuroscientist of some kind at Harvard, and I guess they're studying deep concentration practices. And I'm so glad, and he was explaining to Dan Harris in this video, he was explaining, look, I realize that this can be dangerous for people, and it can. I describe it in an earlier episode, that just because I've gone to retreats, like for instance, the famous one that's really popular in at least in America, the 11-day Vipassana retreat, right? For some people, it might be a quote unquote piece of cake because of their fabricated stuff, or perhaps they're incredibly, they have a long practice and they're accustomed to sitting in long extended sits, so we can't compare and despair, as one of my old admirable voices in my life used to say. But again, I've described this before. I remember housing with someone, at a retreat that was just cleaning the house, just down on their hands and knees, scrubbing floors, and this little bungalow, anything at all, anything to distract herself from looking at the mind. And the mind can be a pretty scary place depending on what your fabricated state is. I have another friend who calls the mind the scene of the crime. The scene of the crime. And I don't know if she made that up, but I think that's a really apt, if you come from a lot of trauma and maybe you've pulled yourself up by your bootstraps and it's got you to where you are in life right now, but now you see that you're suffering in areas, well, you might now need to drop the armor, drop your sword. I know I had to. And that requires some willingness to be vulnerable. And for some, that's like asking them to take their own life, because you are asking them to take their own life. They're identified with their suit of armor, just as you're identified with whatever it is that you believe about yourself or whatever you believe. In transcending itself, it also cuts through all the causes for suffering described in independent co-arising. Because concentration is the clearest practice for seeing attention in action, and acts of discernment are the clearest for seeing intention in action, when both of these forms of fabrication are allowed to drop away, the factor of name disbands. Name, self, world, stuff, ideas, concepts, names, concept, names. It disbands, dissolves, right? Causing all the other factors independent co-arising to disband, leaving an opening to the unfabricated. And again, I'm not going to, because I don't want this to be forever. I'm getting sloppy and letting these get too long. But yeah, I have had a taste of this. And it's beautiful. It's terrifying. It can't be described. And because of that, and because of my reverence for it, I will not even attempt to. So I'm going to move on. So wrong views. Just as DN9 contrasts transcendent right view with the 10 hot questions that philosophers debate in the Buddhist time, and you can go back and you can look at that because it's pretty good stuff. Anyway, let me go back and read that whole thing. Just as DN9 contrasts transcendent right view with the 10 hot questions that philosophers debated in the Buddhist time, AN 10:93 contrasts final right view with the same list of 10 questions. In both cases, the argument is the same. Right view, unlike any attempt to answer those questions, actually leads to the end of suffering. AN 10:93, however, goes a little more into the specifics of why this is so. As Anattapadika, I hope I got that right, points out in that sutta, when you see with right discernment that whatever is fabricated is inconstant, stressful, and not me, not myself, not what I am, you also see the escape that allows you not to be stuck holding on to the stress of the view itself. I'm not going to say anything about that other than meditate on that, journal about that. That's pretty deep. This implies that right view is superior. I would agree. That's my personal take. Because it's a self-reflexive pointing to the need to let go, not only of other fabricated things, but also of itself. Yeah, right? Yeah. SN 1215, as well as Sutta 135, shows that final right view arises when, while watching the arising and passing away of the world, the six sense media, Sutta 63, which include the states of jhana under the sixth, you reach the point where concepts of existence and non-existence don't occur to you. As SN 22:94, Sutta 140 indicates, this doesn't imply the semantic argument that these concepts cannot ever be rightly applied to fabricated phenomena. It simply means that in that state of awareness, there is no basis for giving rise to those concepts. When the concepts aren't there, they don't get in the way of abandoning whatever appears to be stress, even if you've identified with it in the past. For there is no fear of going out of existence if you do. Although concepts of existence and non-existence are not wrong on other levels of right view, they are strategically wrong for this final stage, and so have to be dropped. So some humans have been studying psychedelics for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And hallucinogens like peyote, LSD, varieties of mushrooms, and any other kind of indigenous, ancient, local, peopled discovery hallucinogens describe this. You can also experience it in meditation. You're not going to get it out of a book. You're not going to get it in 30 days. I can tell you that, but, and then some people just experience it for whatever reason, and that kind of glimpse of that there is no bottom it sounds scary, but it's not scary. And again, no one's going to be able to reassure you or to convince you for the reasons that Buddha already said in earlier sections. So interesting stuff though, right? Reading SN 12:15 in conjunction with SN 22:94 helps to counteract a form of wrong view about right view that can sometimes occur within the Buddhist tradition. The belief that final right view is an ultimate truth, whereas earlier versions of right view are only conventional truths. One form of this wrong view states that the beings and worlds mentioned in mundane right view don't really exist. The only existing things are individual events. Another states that on the level of ultimate truth, even individual events can't be described as existing, not existing, both, or neither. And so, again, this is where perhaps some, humans will always agree to disagree, but here the Buddha says clearly that you're not special. If you think, all those good things that you've heard me talk about before, right? That's wrong view. To suggest that people who are experiencing mundane right view, that they are, it doesn't exist. It's attachment. It's, if everything is fabricated, then we know that we know that we have some role to play in fabrication if we practice. Then we also know that inventing, thankfully Buddha found a path that I certainly know works for me, so I don't have to invent it, that mundane right view, following the Eightfold Path, doing this idea of, why do I keep practicing? Why do I continue to, cling to the self that practices Buddhism? Because, Buddha would say it's necessary. It points the mind in the right direction. It points the mind in the right direction, right? Towards skillful action, towards ethical responsibility. And that matters to me a lot. You know what I'm saying? So I'm going to keep reading. It's true that the Buddha occasionally admits to adopting, as a teaching technique, the conventional views of the world without holding to them, see DN 9. But he never makes that statement with regard to mundane right view. And he never refers to any of the forms of right view as ultimate truths. Ooh la la. That doesn't say that in the book. I said that. But he did, right, the Buddha, ultimate truths. Please, right, sit down, get humble. All the levels of the right views are strategies, true on their own terms, beneficial and timely. You pull them out when you need them. You don't need a job. You don't need a screwdriver for this job? Fine. Pull out the wrench. What do you need? And stop worrying about that you wish you bought the other kind of wrench. That's not useful. Let me go back. All of the levels of right view are strategies, true on their own terms, beneficial and timely, which after they have done their work are abandoned for the sake of the higher truth of Nibbana, and that's Sutta 317, which lies beyond all views. As Sutta 139 shows, it's important not to mix up the levels by applying terms or value judgments appropriate to one level of strategy to another. The higher levels could not do their work without the support of mundane right view, and mundane right view is incomplete without the help of the higher levels. As part of the path, each level has its own integrity and should be honored for the work it is able to accomplish. And again, already talked about why, right? Why we need those higher levels, but why we also need mundane right view. You're not special. You're not better. Sit down. Love you. Okay. So now we're at the top of page 146, and the subheading is This, That Conditionality. Although the Buddha used right view to avoid getting involved in many of the metaphysical issues of his time, there was one metaphysical issue that he had to address because it underlies every level of right view. That issue is the question of causality. How does causality work in causing suffering and in giving rise to the path to the end of suffering? In particular, the Buddha had to show how causal principles could work in such a way as to allow for a fabricated path to lead to an unfabricated state, and for the ending of fabrication in the present moment to create an opening for the unfabricated, even when fabrications from the past had not all had time to produce results. Think about what's being said there. I'll wait. This is so radical, right? Another one to journal on, another one to meditate on. So, right, he's saying here, who was he, right? Just like in I know there's a new show on right now, and I don't know if it's called Jesus. It might be called Jesus. But apparently it's at the top of the charts here in the United States where I live. And I haven't seen it. I'm very much looking forward to watching it. But I hear it's outstanding. I hear that the actor who plays Christ is just phenomenal and that he might be up for an award of some kind. And it really depicts, Christ the man. And so a lot of what you see in the suttas and also what, Bhikkhu here is acknowledging here in this passage, is that Buddha was also a teacher. Just like Christ was a teacher, Buddha was a man. He taught before Christ. He had a different, unlike Christ, who was born into poverty. I'm not judging. I'm just saying these were two some people argue that they weren't historical, whatever. I'm just saying, to my knowledge, they're historical people. They that lived, maybe, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, whatever. Buddha, grew up in the warrior class, which means he was very, very high class. And he kind of cast, no pun intended, all that aside to go, follow an ascetic life, and then became a teacher, just like Christ, 40 days and 40 nights and taught. And so, here he's kind of reflecting, Bhikkhu's kind of setting that up for us. He's saying, hey, you'll hear Buddha talk about this idea that, hey, I've got to teach, and you got to know your audience, right? That we don't use the same message on everybody and that when you meditate and you really start to kind of, really start to develop sensitivity as a teacher, right? The Buddha talks about this. Then you can see how your messaging is landing. Oh, that wasn't working. Okay. Oh, that's good. So here, Buddha's saying, look, I'm a teacher. In my culture, I'm a teacher, and people are going to expect me. They're going to expect me to use kind of reason, right? Because they're going to argue. They're gonna, much like later in the Socratic kind of way of discussion. Buddha wasn't like a sage on the stage, okay? People had quite, what about this? What about that? What do you mean this? What do you mean that, right? And again, I don't know what the manners were, so I don't want to talk out of my depth of knowledge, but so he acknowledged, look, I'm going to be expected to have the answers to these questions, to be able to put, as we say in America, to put your money where your mouth is. You're going to make a claim? Oh, yeah? Because he can't show proof, right? So here, he's saying this kind of that conditionality, and he's saying he's kind of come up with this method of kind of providing a potential kind of mental kind of riddle, that could help people to kind of see for themselves what he's getting at here. Because causality was a hotly debated topic in his time, he couldn't simply say that causality happened or that he accepted all forms of causality, because many of the causal theories advanced by his contemporaries, such as strict determination or random chaos, didn't allow for the development of skills needed to put an end to suffering. Do you see what he's saying here? I think we're seeing that right now. And we're moving from one particular framework strict determinism, right? And another framework, what we're seeing right now, I think it feels like chaos, right? That kind of chaotic, kind of kinetic energy that comes with I would say in our case, psychological change because of our what I would perceive to be addiction to technology, just global changes, infrastructure, politics. There's so much going on, right? Technology is advancing much faster than our brains were really designed to adapt for it, right? So he realizes, if I'm going to be a teacher, right, I gotta be ready to put my money where my mouth is. Yeah. because people are going to be like, I don't buy that. What do you mean? You saying my karma is ripening? You're saying this is why this is happening to me? Is that what you're saying? F you, Buddha. Right? I'm assuming, and I'm going to go, I promise I'm going to drop this and do some research and drop what I find out in the thread about, what was it like in his time? Like, was it more Socratic? I don't even know how it really was for Socrates, but I believe with Socrates, there was absolutely no hierarchy, I believe, and that you could just, I'm not really sure. So I'm going to find out more about the organization there, but I believe, that, there was respect, but not reverence. Nobody saw Buddha as a god. Yeah, Buddha was never a god. Buddha's not a god. There are no gods in Buddhism. Outside of they're kind of manufactured kind of representations of what you... And I realize that people are going to... Okay, I'm just saying. Okay, so I'm going to read on here. His explanation was a teaching that he called this, that conditionality. Idapakayata. Ooh, I'm sorry if I wrecked that. And expressed in the following formula. 1. When this is, that is. 2. From the arising of this, that arises. 3. When this isn't, that isn't. And 4. From the cessation of this, that ceases. And that comes from SN 12:61. This formula is actually the intersection of two pairs of principles working together. The first pair describe causality in the present moment. When this is, that is. When this isn't, that isn't. The cause is simultaneous with the result. And when the cause disappears, the result immediately disappears. The second pair describe causality over time. From the arising of this, that arises. From the cessation of this, that ceases. The cause may appear and disappear at one time, but the effect can come and go either right away or much later. An example of the first kind of causality would be sticking your finger into a fire. You don't have to wait until your next lifetime to get the result. The fire burns right away. I've always really liked that metaphor. Or simile or whatever. I forget which is what. It's been a minute. But I'm gonna bring one that's a little bit more subtle. Because sometimes that one's so easy for us to see, but we might have a hard time kind of moving it from that to what's actually happening in our mind. When what's going on isn't actually a hot flame, but some kind of a thought or emotional experience that feels like a hot flame, but we don't realize that we actually have any agency over it. Okay, so here he's using this idea of, the first kind. When this is, that is. Right? When I stick my finger in the flame, that flame burns my finger, right? When I do this, this happens. From the arising of my decision to put the finger in the flame and then take the action of putting my finger in the flame, what arises is the natural nature of what flame does. Consumes my finger. Okay, but let's take it a step further. Let me really show you the magic of how you can work with this in meditation here, right? When this is, that is. When I'm angry and I start to shout at my friend, by the way, I never do this. I never shout. But let's just say, when I get angry and shout at my friend reacts. Good, right? It was a good one. Wasn't that a really good one? Cause and effect. From the arising of this, that arises. From the arising of habitual anger and feeding of anger in the body, anger and hostility and the experience of anger and hostility arises in my surroundings. Really radical, right? This is pretty radical stuff. So there we go. And then kind of getting into the, when this isn't, that isn't. It's, it's okay. So I'm gonna keep it moving here, but I think that could be a good way to think about it. Because we get the fire one, but sometimes, like I know it was like, well, yeah, I get that. That's a no-brainer. But what happens when in the moment, or I notice that I have this bit, that's a little bit different, right? And the idea in Buddhism is not to rid yourself of all of those propensities. They are you. We are fabrication. You can't outrun your fabrication. This is a method for working with it, right? Working with the self that isn't a self. The second pair describes causality over time. From the arising of this, that arises. From the cessation of this, that ceases. An example of the second type of causality would be planting a seed in the field. You won't get a mature plant right away. It will take time, well after you stop the action of planting the seed, and perhaps not even in this lifetime. And so again, what can I do in this lifetime with my anger, with my propensity for anger? I can dedicate myself and commit myself to the Eightfold Path. That's one decision that I made. And actually, that was kind of really, at this point in my life, I would say that that's kind of the only, for me personally, speaking for myself, I've had lots of other things. Yeah, I follow, that's really important to me. It's a big part of my life. I'm also an embodiment coach, and I continue my training, so right now I'm I don't want to name drop because then you'll think that I'm paid to sell you things, and I'm really not. So I'll just say that right now I'm continuing my training and learning some new things so that I can continuously reconnect over and over and over again with my embodied state, and also working against my comfort zone with the more embodied processes that are much more difficult for me. Social embodiment, just being embodied socially. So at any rate, I think I'm going to stop right there because I've been reading a long time and I am kind of done reading now. But I want to say thank you so much. If you're following along, thank you for your support and for listening. I really appreciate it. And we're going to stop right here and we'll pick up at the second paragraph, it looks like, the page 147 next week. And take great care of yourself and be well. Bye.